Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, and also president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, with a conversation regarding or with my fellow Providence editors, managing editor Mark Melton and executive editor Marc LiVecche. Mark Melton and I are here in wonderful Virginia, sheltering from the pandemic. And Marc LiVecche is in Oxford, England, where he will remain through the end of this summer. And this conversation will be the first of a series titled Marksism, M-A-R-K-S-I-S-M. And hopefully what we have to say will be insightful, provocative, and helpful. I'm going to start off our conversation with a few observations about I'll call it our older brother publication, First Things, which was founded by Richard John Newhouse 30 years ago. Richard John Newhouse, of course, was the founder of IRD, Institute on Religion and Democracy, 10 years previously. So we have that common heritage, and rightly, we have always looked to First Things as being the premier intellectual voice for traditional religion and how it expresses itself in public life for most of the last 30 years, but it's taken a little bit of a unusual and often disturbing turn these last several years, and often seems not as committed to the principles of American democracy, and from an ecumenical and interfaith perspective that Richard Newhouse did so well. The most recent controversy being that First Things editor Rusty Reno tweeted out that those who were wearing masks during the pandemic were quote unquote cowards, which set off quite a bit of a brouhaha, and was an amplification of his ongoing critique of those who were, from his perspective, overly concerned about the pandemic. He finally cryptically apologized and took down his Twitter feed altogether, which is never a very good sign for the CEO and public spokesman for any organization. So it's saddening and disturbing that many traditional Christians and other traditional religious believers no longer look to First Things as speaking for them. So Marc LiVecche and Mark Melton, any thoughts on First Things?
I'll let you go, Mel.
Oh, you'll let me go first? Okay. So my first thought with this is that sometimes there are things that come to your mind that you don't need to tweet out. And a lot of people get into the habit of doing something provocative, and it helps get you followers, it helps get you attention, but then sometimes it blows up in your face, and sometimes it's more prudential to just wait and see if this is something that's worth tweeting out. But it is a habit I think a lot of people get into, and it's a pitfall. So usually the more boring Twitter feed is a little bit more safer.
Yeah, there's certainly prudence in that, for sure. And I can think of a lot of CEOs of major organizations or even countries that I wish would actually disband their Twitter feed. I guess there's a couple of questions that I have. One is a question that a number of commentators have been asking, and that is to inquire whether or not the crisis at First Things, or the crisis with Rusty, is that their crisis alone, or is it indicative of a larger crisis somewhere? And if it is a larger crisis somewhere, what is that somewhere? Is it conservative intellectualism? Is it the Christian right and the way we think through issues? I mean, we started Providence in part because we saw certain inadequacies in the way the Christian right, or Christians generally, think about particular issues. So we know there's a problem there. The positive spin, if I could give it one, sort of to try to make sense of what otherwise appears to be, almost, just some sort of really bizarre, breakdown, is that I think there's an element of what I understand Rusty's critique to be that I agree with. And a part of it is, sometime back he had an article, I think it might have been one of his diaries, where he was pushing back against what he was calling the culture of death or something really sort of overblown and hyperbolic like that. But his critique came down, I think, essentially to, we know there are some things that are worse than death. We should pay attention to what those things are. He wasn't trying to base the economy versus, old people, but he was trying to say there's a way of living and there's a way of fearing death. We have to get that right. In complicated circumstances where there doesn't seem to be a good thing that's obvious to do, but a whole bunch of very complicated and maybe difficult things to do, we need to be able to think through these things. So at the end of it, I think part of his critique is lamenting that Christians have lost the ability to do what could be called moral triage. And I think that's something that we've touched on. Dan Strand is touching on it in his article on using the Bible, that there aren't necessarily, in all cases or even most, a bunch of freestanding, simple to follow principles that Christians have to follow, and we get ethical life right. Actually, there are general principles, things like love, justice, and we have to take those general principles, understand the context of our times, and try to apply them with as much prudential wisdom as we can. I think Rusty's exhausted by the inability of some people to be able to do that. He was pushing back against it. I think he's exhausted by a lot of the virtue signaling that things like wearing a mask easily allows people to do. And then we can point our fingers at everybody else and say, ha, you're not as virtuous as I am. I think he's exhausted by that. So I think he demonstrates the conservative ability to identify a problem and the conservative weakness of going way off in the other direction and making equal but opposite mistakes. Maybe. That's the best I can do with that traffic accident.
Well, and it should be pointed out that the tweets and the ongoing dismissive comments about the pandemic are part of a larger trajectory. For me, the key moment was in 2018, the article First Things published justifying the infamous 1850s case in which the Catholic Church in Rome essentially kidnapped a Jewish baby who had been secretly baptized by its Catholic nanny or housekeeper, a great travesty of justice. And it was that First Things would, in effect, endorse that was certainly against the subverting the legacy of Richard John Newhouse. Rusty Reno did later apologize for that article, but again, First Things often appeared to be heading in a very esoterically Catholic direction, increasingly integralist, but then publishing other articles who weren't from that perspective. So it's been very mixed and peculiar overall, and perhaps this is an opportunity, or Providence now has a duty to move in and fill some of this space in terms of public conversation for Christians in America, but especially for Protestants and evangelicals who feel increasingly cut out of First Things. What do you think, Marc LiVecche?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in part that's why we formed ourselves. We identified that gap. We're filling it. I think this provides a real opportunity for us to step in. I think the Christian critique needs to happen. I think we have done it, I think, in a way that is far more winsome, far more ironic than First Things has been able to pull off recently. So yeah, I think there's a gap. There's a lot of stuff that First Thing covers that we don't. And so I was just talking with my wife about, what are the magazines that are out there that can fill in some of those other gaps if First Things continues to slide away. Maybe it's the Stream, maybe it's some of our allied publications, but yeah, Providence has a real opportunity. I think we should covenant together as editors that if we find ourselves, or any one of us, constantly making public apologies for something we've written, we should have an editorial meeting. Work that out. That might signal that something is actually wrong.
Well, if we have to take down Mark Melton's Twitter feed, obviously that will be a negative sign for all of us.
My feed's not that interesting.
Maybe you need to step it up. Well, secondly, I was going to briefly mention my interview with Christian pacifist Shane Claiborne this past week, which appeared on IRD's blog, not the Providence blog, but obviously also relates to Providence's purpose of lifting up historic Christian teaching about issues of War and Peace, and the interview was very enjoyable and gracious on his part, but did not really answer my core questions in terms of how does a advocate for Christian social justice expect such justice to exist absent the coercive powers of the state. He, of course, has no answer for that. As far as I can tell, Christian pacifism really has no answer for that. He simply cited the example of the early church fathers as he perceived it, as being entirely rejecting of war and lethal force. But did you have any thoughts, Marc Melton or Marc LiVecche?
Go ahead,
Go
Melton.
first.
What's that?
You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
You're the managing editor. You
I'm
tell
the
me.
man.
I'll take it.
You go first.
I'll take it away.
All right.
Yeah, I was of two minds on your interview. I love the fact that you simply got him on the record. You got him saying the things that he believed. You asked good questions, and he answered them as thoroughly as he was able. Obviously, you could have gone after the jugular a couple of times, but I think it was great simply to give him his space to talk, because I think the inadequacies were self-evident. Obviously, I'm biased, and I'm hearing with a certain. I hear the pacifists at a certain frequency that other people probably don't hear them. But yeah, the thing that stood out for me is a couple of the things when, very romanticized idea about how one can live life in this world. He was constantly getting up and showing you his heroes that are on his wall. And it occurred to me that the vast majority, if not all of, I'd have to go through the whole catalog, but the vast majority of those heroes were able to do heroic things in societies that were, by and large, under the rule of law, and functioned in ways that would allow their particular protest. If it was Martin Luther King, if it was Gandhi, they had real adversaries, I get that, but they had adversaries who, by and large, followed the rule of law, pursued justice. A lot of his heroes' critiques would not have worked in totalitarian societies that don't allow dissent. And so the inconsistency of, and frankly, the parasitic inconsistency of benefiting from a society that is under the rule of law because there are men and women who stand on freedom's wall to protect dissent, and then to knock the apparatus that provides for the rule of law, I think is a poor witness to what Christian gratitude looks like, to what Christian responsibility looks like. So those are some of my frustrations. He has a line that he uses a lot, and he used it with you, where he says, there are all sorts of things that I would die for. There's nothing that I would kill for. And I suppose if I had to put words to how I respond to that, and maybe this is bothersome to some, but somebody who has nothing in the world that they would kill for, I think is leading a pretty hollow and empty life. When I reflect on those things that I think a just warrior would kill for, I pretty quickly realize that those are all the same things that I would live for, but you change the circumstances a little bit, and you have a different set of responsibilities. I think of my kids, in the next room playing. To not, I'm absolutely willing to die for them if the situation requires it, and if my death is effective in securing their safety and well-being. How I would not also be willing, in the last resort, when all else has failed, in discriminating in proportionate ways, to use force to protect them, is anathema. I think it's unchristian. I think it's uncharitable. So, and I think your conversation with him demonstrated that pacifism at the end of the day is, I think, both uncharitable and therefore unchristian. So.
On a related topic, let me ask Marc Melton to describe an article we posted this week from our contributing editor, Daniel Strand, critiquing Christians who reject nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, evangelicals and Catholics, making the point that the Bible simply does not give us counsel on the ethics of nuclear weapons. But Mark Melton, share a little bit about that, if you would.
Right. So Daniel Strand, a contributing editor, wrote about a couple of evangelicals who were critical of the possibility that the U.S. would not reauthorize the New START treaty, which is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And Strand's basic argument, or one of his arguments, is that the Bible isn't going to tell you in particular whether or not the U.S. should be part of this treaty. It may be wise, it may not be wise, but you have to understand a lot more than just a couple of Bible verses to come to a good conclusion of whether or not this treaty actually achieves what it's supposed to achieve and whether that's a good thing. And so I generally, LiVecche might have a thought on this, but whenever I think of like just war tradition, I think about some of these, political, theological ideas. The Bible isn't going to give you an exact number for what should the tax rate be. It may give you some wisdom on, being charitable and prioritizing different things. And some things are just out of bounds, but you're not going to get a very specific prescription on a policy. And that is one of the arguments that Daniel Strand makes in relation to nuclear weapons and to the New START treaty.
Marc LiVecche, what are your thoughts on Christians and nuclear weapons?
Christians and nuclear weapons.
And of course, you're writing
moral
a book
triage,
now on
right?
Hiroshima.
What was that?
You are now completing your own book on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I am. So again, it's moral triage, right? So as Melton says, Bible is full of, Bible is a book teaching us how to live life. Paul Ramsey provocatively said that there are very few rules in Christianity. And in fact, Christianity is sometimes a religion without rules. And he doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. He just means that there are principles. But as I suggested earlier, the principles are sometimes seemingly vague. Love, pursue justice. These things might look very different in different circumstances. I love both of you guys, but I love you very differently than I love my children. I certainly love you differently than I love my wife. I love you differently than I love my neighbor who I might have an antagonistic relationship with, but I have to love you all. So love looks different in all sorts of situations. Were I to live in an Edenic world, I would not want nuclear weapons. Given that I don't, I should have a pause point here. I still might prefer to live in a world without nuclear weapons, but that would have to be a world in which there are no nuclear weapons. Nobody has them. But given the fact, present day, that they are out there, that the technology is out there, that people can reconstitute them if they get rid of them, people can build them if they don't have them. The realities of the world seem to me that you need to have nuclear weapons if you want the stability and the peace, frankly, that nuclear weapons have maybe macabrely purchased us. They've only been used twice. I think they had to be used when they were used, and it was a horrific event. But again, you do the moral triage and you look at your available options and you ask what is the greatest possible good that we can do in this given situation. And we chose in the 1940s to use them. Now, looking at the scene, we ask ourselves what is the greatest possible good we can do. And unfortunately, the greatest possible good we can do right now is to have the right amount of nuclear weapons that are well tested and clearly deterring, and to use them with prudence. So,
well, on that note, Mark Melton, managing editor of Providence, Marc LiVecche, executive editor of Providence, and speaking for myself, editor of Providence. I hope you have enjoyed this first conversation of Marxism, hopefully to be continued next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you, Marks.